Hey everyone, welcome to Aaron Fails at Cameras, and occasionally we shoot a wine promo. This is our Valentine's Day promo, and we will be tasting some rosés, some red, and something very special at the tail end. We did a rosé tasting for Valentine's Day last year, and it was a huge hit, and I wanted to do something similar, but I also didn't want to repeat myself. So we are going to do a rosé tasting, but maybe not the one you're thinking of. Like, it would be very easy to do like a Provence rosé or a South French rosé, but no, we're not doing that. We're going to do the Rosza Petsovits from Franz Weninger, which is kind of rosé that's also an orange wine. It comes from both Austria and Hungary. It's super wild, super crazy. It's a huge hit for us. We sell a ton of it, but this is not a wine for everybody. And yet, I kind of think it is. I think even though it's so wild and crazy, it's so delicious, it's going to appeal to a broad market. So that's our big challenging one. We're going to roll that into a little bit of sparkling, because what's Valentine's Day without a little bit of pink sparkling wine? This is one that I've wanted to do for a while, but we've never had enough stock. We always have the Blanquette de Limoux from these folks. We always have the Cremant de Limoux, but the rosé is always in short supply. This comes from Limoux, the original home of sparkling wine. It's made predominantly from Pinot Noir. It's got some Mosaic, it's got some Chenin, got some Chardonnay. It's very much in a champagne style, except it's not $65 a bottle. Now, because it's Valentine's Day, we're doing the Love Red. That's a terrible reason to do it, but it's a really fun wine. This was, for a very long time, our best-selling red wine in the store, and I want to talk about kind of that new school Californian style that the folks at Cellars have been doing.
Finally!
It's Valentine's Day, and I'm gonna do something dumb. We are going to do the Aizuhomare Sake Brewery Company's Chocolate Nigori Sake. Not only is it a cloudy sake, it's also got chocolate in it. I'm sure a lot of you are making a face. A lot of you are horrified, especially if you can see how chunky this is, because it is a chunky boy. This is absolutely something that drinks like chocolate milk. It's the most sumptuous, delicious thing. It doesn't taste weird, it doesn't taste challenging, it just tastes like chocolate, and I want more people to put this in their mouths because I think it's absolutely incredible. So, we had some rosé, we had some sparkling wine, we had a little bit of kind of fun Valentine's themed red, and then we got some chocolates. This is our Valentine's lineup, coming up on Friday, February the 18th at 6 o'clock. I can't wait to see you for this one. Media Boutique. Hello everyone. Welcome to our Valentine's wine tasting. And also Sky's first time running the show solo, so good luck, Sky. I'm going to make it as difficult as I possibly can for you. So, we're talking about Valentine's wine. What is Valentine's wine? Absolutely no such thing. Realistically, you should be serving whatever you're doing for dinner. You should be serving something that goes with that. But this is Wine Tasting 43, and you try coming up with 43 wine topics. You run out of countries real fast. So, what are we actually going to be talking about tonight since we're doing a Valentine's tasting? We're going to do a little bit of rosé. We're going to start with the Cuvée Ma Maison Rosé from Domaine Rosier. We're going to be doing the Rosza Petsovits, the really, really pretty rosé from Franz Weninger. Cellars is bringing us their Love Red. And finally, we'll be finishing with Aizuhomare's Chocolate Nigori Sake, which is just fun. I hope you all can actually keep yourselves out of it to the very end. I have managed, as you can tell by the liquid level in the bottle, I have managed to stay out of it so far. We'll get to it at the end. So, let's get started. We're going to dive right into the Rosier, which you notice I'm serving in its own separate glass. I have a different glass for the other stuff, purely because I'm worried I'm going to be allergic to it, as I'm allergic to so many other sparkling wines. So, let's dig into it. It's a rosé. It is sparkling. It's from France. Specifically, it is from Limoux in the extreme southeast of France. It is part of the Languedoc-Roussillon southeastern wine region. It's a little further inland, and I believe, Sky, we have a map for this. It's not super maps. We're not doing super maps, but we are going to have a map.
It's up.
It's up. All right. So, You are seeing here all of the Cremant regions that are made in France, and there are quite a few. Alsace, of course, has one, Cremant de Loire, Cremant de Bourgogne. There are so many different regions that are actually happening in France that all have their own separate sparkling wine. Even Bordeaux does make sparkling wine. Not very much, but they do make some. But the most important of all of them by far is Limoux, it down in the southeast corner next to the Languedoc, or as part of the Languedoc. The reason that they're the most important is that they've actually been making sparkling wine that we can prove since 1531. That's about a full century earlier than the folks in Champagne. Now, you know, Champagne does have this lovely story that they like to tell. I think we're done with maps, Sky. Champagne has this lovely story they like to tell about Dom Perignon, how he had studied down at this abbey in Limoux, and that he'd gone up to Champagne and he'd, you know, invented sparkling wine in Champagne, and oh my brothers, I'm drinking stars. Yes, for that to work, Dom Perignon would have had to have been about 130 years old when that story supposedly happens, because it's nonsense. Dom Perignon probably was the first to really popularize sparkling wine, but his big contributions, at least in terms of his writing, is actually towards the improvement in production of still wines. Sparkling wine production in Champagne was starting to get going at that time, and Dom Perignon was most certainly one of the preeminent winemakers of his era, but the tie to Dom Perignon and sparkling wine is tenuous at best. The best you can say is he lived in Champagne and worked in wine at about the era where sparkling wine was kind of starting to come out of Limoux and end up in Champagne. Now, this wine region does make still wines. We actually do carry a Chenin Blanc from Limoux that is done as a still wine. A very, very nice one, actually. But this region predominantly is best known for their sparkling. So let's talk a little bit about old Limoux wine. We'll taste the wine, and then we'll talk about the modern stuff. So if we're going back to 1531, how they would have made the sparkling wine then would have been very much like what we now call a pet nat. So the wine would have been partially fermented in the fall. It would have been bottled. It would have been put down in the cellars to age. But those cellars, you know, they're quite cold. They're quite damp. So the fermentation would stall. The yeast would still be alive, but it would go into its inert phase. And basically the wine would stop fermenting because of the cold temperatures and the increasingly rising pressure. And it would just hang out. And then when temperatures rose in the spring, the temperature in the caves would rise as well, and the fermentation would restart. But now the wine was already bottled. So for quite a while, they had some real issues with bottles exploding. But when they realized that they could just make the glass a bit thicker and make the closures a little tighter, they could actually end up with some beautifully sparkling wine. Pre-glass bottling in France, we don't have sparkling wine because wine wasn't sold in bottles. It would have been filled into leather skins or into earthenware pots, like right at the winery, and you've taken it home, much like a growler from a liquor store or brewery now. I'd even enjoyed it over the next couple, 3 days. The idea of having a wine from a different region that was in a glass bottle that could be bought and sold and traded was something that came out again in the very early 16th century, basically contemporaneously with sparkling wine, because sparkling wine started as an accident. So let's taste the wine in our glasses here. Unfortunately, it does in some years, but this particular year, the Cuvée Ma Maison Cremant de Limoux Rosé does not contain Mauzac. And Mauzac is kind of the native grape of the Limoux region. Their kind of core sparkling wine, which is known as Blanquette de Limoux, or the little wine of Limoux. That actually must contain Mauzac by law. I think it has to be 35% Mauzac by law, but their Cremants don't have to contain it, and this one does not. It is a blend of Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Chenin Blanc, and it is the Pinot that is contributing to the pink color here. On the nose, I think this is really charming. I get red berries. I get particularly strawberry and cherry. I do get kind of the warning signs of you're going to be allergic to this, in the sense that my nose is already itching. I will taste a tiny bit of this, but no more than that. In the mouth, I get nice creaminess from that champagne-style fermentation, or méthode traditionnelle type fermentation, which we'll talk about in a sec. But I also get like those bright, fresh berries. It's really appealing. Imagine this with like a wheel of brie, or imagine this with like, you know, a fresh summer salad with, say, goat cheese and strawberries. It's just a wonderful everyday sparkling wine. we're doing it kind of as a Valentine's as a special day, and you should do a sparkling wine with it. But really, you could drink this 365 days of the year, and it would always just be lovely and appealing and light, and kind of encapsulate all the things I like about just a nice Southern French rosé, like a Rosé de Provence, but also have that autolytic, yeasty, brioche characteristic from that méthode traditionnelle fermentation. Now, I've referred to that a couple times, so let's talk about modern Limoux winemaking, or modern sparkling wine winemaking. There's a few different ways you can make sparkling wine. You can just do the Coca-Cola method, where you put wine in the bottle, basically shove it in your big industrial soda stream and shoot CO2 into it. That's how they make things like Spumante Bambino and other things that are terrible. That's certainly one way. We talked about the pet nat method of basically stopping the fermentation with cold temperature, bottling it, and then letting it warm up and recarbonate and finish its fermentation in the bottle. That's how pet nats are made, and basically no other style. But secondary fermentation, whether in the bottle or in a tank, in the case of Prosecco, is the main way we do it. And that's because you get these autolytic yeast characteristics. So basically, you finish making a perfectly fermented dry white or rosé wine, or if you're in, say, Lambrusco, you can do it with a red. So you make these fully fermented dry wines, you put it in the bottle, you age it on its lees, and then you add the vin de tirage, the wine that makes it, the liqueur de tirage, which basically is a mixture of fresh yeast and sugar. You pour that into the bottle and you allow it to recarbonate over a period of time. And that's what gives you the sparkling. So it's actually fermented twice. So that's how Champagne, every Cremant in France, Spanish Cava, and I'd say 95 to 98% of white wines, sparkling wines that you're going to see on the market are done this way. The reason I'll say 95 and not 98 is you kind of have to make room for the Prosecco gorilla in the room. It's done in a very similar way, except rather than every single bottle having its own secondary fermentation, it's done in a big steel tank. If you want to be romantic about it, you call it the Charmat method. These days they teach it actually as the tank method, because it's aged in a big steel tank. That's broadly how it's all done, and I quite like the characteristic of it. This is also something I'm very allergic to, so I'm not going to have anymore. But I mean, it adds this richness, it adds this nuttiness, it adds this secondary characteristic that I love, by the way, and I'm heartbroken that I can't have anymore. What else do we have here? No comments or questions yet, so we will roll merrily right along, if only because I'd like to have a wine in my glass that I can actually drink. If you have any questions about sparkling wine, about wines from Limoux, about any of that, please do jump in. I'm somewhat selfishly not spending as much time on this as I would have liked, but I can already feel myself itching from that tiny, tiny sip. So, moving merrily right along, this is from Franz Weninger. This is his Rosza Petsovits. Rosza in this case does not mean rosé. It's actually named for Franz's grandmother, whose name was Rosza Petsovits. This is a blend of Syrah, Zweigelt, and Pinot Noir, I believe. I'm just going to quickly double check that while I can. Yes, Syrah, Zweigelt, Pinot Noir. Now, the Syrah is giving this pretty bluish characteristic. This is fairly dark for a rosé. Franz is, of course, a natural winemaker, so you've got no sulfites, no artificial acidification, no chaptalization, no pesticide, no herbicide, no nothing. In fact, they don't even use cultured yeast. They allow this to be a wild ferment. And when you do that, and when you don't oak the ever-loving piss out of it, you end up with a rosé that's kind of light and fresh and pretty and encapsulates all of the characteristics of the fruit rather than the oak barrel or kind of the winemaker's interpretation of what the wine should be. It's a gross oversimplification to say that the wine makes itself, but that is kind of the ethos of the natural wine movement, is let the grapes speak to you. They're going to tell you what the wine's supposed to be. Stop monkeying around with it to make it what you want it to be. Now on this one, we are definitely seeing much more of an influence of the grape skins here. I think while here, you might have gotten a suggestion of tannin, you might have got a little tiny prickle of tartness from the tannic acid. It's not really there. You're getting the bright, pretty berries from the actual grape skins, but you're not getting a lot of tannin, you're not getting a lot of grip. This most certainly has a grippy red wine style mouthfeel on it. And I think that's definitely coming, well, in fact, I know it's definitely coming from a little bit longer maceration with those grape skins. They're also using, quite a bit darker skins with Syrah, with Zweigelt. We have quite dark colored berries, and it ends up with one that's much more big and fat. And also, I do like, and I kind of chose this strategically for this kind of sits on that line of, is it a very dark rosé or is it a very light red? And that's part of the reason this doesn't say it's a rosé, it doesn't say it's a red. It could be either. I'm having mine chilled, but if you're serving yours room temperature, while we're having different experiences, I think we're both having very, very nice experiences because they're very, very, it's a very versatile wine for that. We are really not coming in for the comments, but that's all right. Sky, do you have comments or is it just my Facebook is not working?
Nope.
We're all right. Fair enough. Talking to myself. Good.
We got 3 viewers on YouTube though. Say hello to your.
And hello to my 3 whole YouTube viewers. There we go. Aaron taking himself a generous glass of wine because he's not technically working tonight. Sky's running the show. There you go. And you can pretend that you're not going to drink that whole thing. Yes. Yeah. So why are we talking about this? Why not a different rosé? Well, I wanted to talk about this because, one, we've talked about just about every rosé in the store because I really like rosés. And 2, this one, because it sits right on that border between having a very, very dark color, but also being something that can be very chilled. This is a topic that I really like because rosé and red, they're made in effectively the same way, unless you're doing the Saignée method, which is just weird. They're made in exactly the same way, and where you stop that maceration, where you stop leaving the wine on its grape skins to pull out color, to pull out tannin, if you're doing, say, a 16-hour maceration, you're probably going to end up with about this color. And I've had wines that called themselves red wines that were this color, or even a bit paler. And I've certainly had rosés that were even a shade darker. And then it gets even weirder when you start talking about teinturiers like the grape Alicante Bouchette. Alicante Bouchette, now most grape skins, everything that we have on the table tonight, it's even if it's a dark red berry, if you cut it open, it has green skin, and if you crush it very gently, it will give you completely clear juice. You can make a white wine from a red grape, even say Cabernet Sauvignon, if you're gentle enough. No one's going to be gentle enough because to put that little pressure on the skins, you're going to get basically no juice out of the berry, and you're not going to make any money. You'd have to charge a couple $100 a bottle. But with teinturiers, they actually have red flesh, and they're a fairly obscure, less than 3% of grape varieties out there are teinturiers. You're actually going to end up with wine that's about this color right from the first crush. Now, by how we define a rosé or define a red, as in a wine that was crushed and then aged on its skins to derive color and tannin, if you don't do that with an Alicante, you just crush the grapes, let them run off free juice, and then bottle it, it's technically a white wine, but it can actually be darker than this. So I like that this introduces kind of an interesting conversation. I've not been to this winery. Devin, of course, has. He actually spent a couple weeks in Austria-Hungary and got to meet with Franz Weninger. And this is a wine that does very well for us, not as well as, say, Mein Klein Prosa, but still does very, very well. Mark wants a glass of wine.
We're coming for the Petsovits.
You were coming for the Petsovits? Well, drink that and we'll get you some Petsovits. Tastes like spring. That's an interesting thought. Let's dive into this a little more. Tasting notes on this are kind of challenging. I mean, I get blueberries actually as the main dominant fruit here. I get something kind of reminiscent of rhubarb. And then after that, it's almost strawberry. And I always hesitate to say strawberry because strawberry is so hard to encapsulate in a wine. It's the reason you don't see a lot of strawberry beers. The aromatics that come from strawberries are quite unique to strawberry, and why no artificial strawberry anything actually tastes like strawberries. It tastes like the color red. But strawberry is very difficult. It's difficult for a wine to ape it. It's difficult to make an artificial version of it. And when you try to ferment with it, when you try to make a beer and flavor it with strawberries, the process of fermentation, the process of canning, the process of just being in the can for a week, it can really destroy that characteristic. It's very, very delicate. It doesn't survive well. So when a wine actually shows that characteristic, is very unusual. Blueberry is also relatively unusual in terms of being in a wine. When we talk about a wine, whether it be a rosé or a red, what are we usually looking for? We're looking for cherry. That's always going to be number one, especially black cherry. We're going to be looking for black currants and even red currants, although that's a little bit rarer. And we're certainly going to be looking for raspberry, blackberry. Those are kind of the big three. Those are going to tick off the boxes for 95% of the reds in the store and almost 100% of the rosés. You could pretty much say the fruit characteristics are going to be some combination of raspberry, blackberry, cherry, black cherry, and either red or black currants. And that's pretty much everything. This kind of bucks that trend, and I don't get a lot of cherry out of it. I maybe get a blackberry, but I predominantly get blueberry, strawberry, and that's very unusual. In the mouth, it definitely has that tannin. It's got that nip on the sides of your tongue. I would say that we're using Syrah, which is a very tannic grape variety. Anytime you make, and part of the reason you don't see a lot of Syrah rosés is you do get that initial big bite, and that's also part of what makes this a really nice food wine. And again, part of why it kind of sits that, oh, Aaron's regretting his double burger dinner.
Definitely.
Yeah. While we were setting up, Aaron crushed, what was a bacon portobello mushroom melt followed by like a bacon JBC. Classic? Oh, you went for a JBC? Yeah. Double burger dinner. And now Aaron has regrets.
Double-barreled bad ideas.
Yep.
Yeah, coming at you.
Definitely a bad idea. There's also something, I don't know if it's fresh mint or just general green plants, but there's something a little haunting with this. It's not cucumber. It's not exactly mint. It's not eucalyptus or anything like that. It's not aloe. But there's something here that reminds me of spring water or green plants or ozone after a rainfall. And I think it was Don Vickers who said it tastes like spring. Yeah, it tastes like spring rain or new plants. It has a very unique characteristic that is, to me, almost unique to this wine. It's not to say that I don't have wines that occasionally come off like this. Vino Verde can come off like this, but they're not very common. Yeah, of course it can. This side. There you are.
Five viewers on YouTube.
Hey, 5 on YouTube. That's got to be close to a record. Gonna get to that 1,000 mark one of these days. Just have to get 200% times. Yeah, we're gonna get there.
Good.
200 times. Yeah. Okay, so that's Rosza Petsovits and the Malmaison Rosé, what I think are two absolutely fantastic wines. Very, very different, but very true to their style. I mean, this is very much a Franz Weninger style wine. If you've had his, say, Balvcak Francos, it's very much a bigger version of this. If you've had any of his whites, they tend to be very much based in the soils where they're grown. Mark your back for the Petsovits, I see that. This is very much what I would expect from Franz Weninger, and this is very much what I would expect from Limpux. So let's move on. Let's move on to our red. Now this is the Cellars Love Red. And very interestingly, I was all prepared to go on a big tangent about Valentine and its importance to this wine, for the 2020 vintage, he didn't use Valentine. It's Zinfandel, Carignan, and I have to look it up. Zinfandel, Carignan are the major components. The last is 6% Grenache Noir, 52 Carignan, 42 Zin, 6 Grenache Noir, which is probably why I didn't remember, as it's not exactly an important part of the blend. Cellars got its start in 2006. Chris Brockway's been making wine since 2004. And they have this really cool urban winery. I was there a few years ago. They're based in Berkeley, California, in kind of like an old industrial building. They're actually across the street from like a still operating like concrete cement plant. And they make these really neat, offbeat, different Californian wines that aren't anything like what you'd get out of, say, J. Lohr or Kendall Jackson or Josh Cellars, which tend to produce wines that are very high in alcohol, 14, 14.5. They are universally oak aged, generally American oak because it's cheaper than European. It also gives you more of that, over the top oak characteristic that a lot of people are looking for. And finally, he uses grape varieties that aren't that common. I mean, Zin is certainly something you see a lot of in California, although never on like a bestsellers list. But Carignan unusual. Valdigues is unusual. Grenache Noir, at least in California, is quite unusual. These are not grape varieties that we talk about a whole lot. Carignan's kind of an interesting one. It was actually the grape variety most behind the wine lake of the early 2000s in France, which gave us wines like Fat Bastard and all of those cutesy named French wines that started popping out of France about 2005, 2006. This is a grape variety that is very prolific, will give you tons of fruit, will give you lots and lots of tonnage per hectare. And actually at one point was France's most planted grape. And I'll turn around and say, okay, well, in France, what region is famous for Carignan? You go to Bordeaux and you've got Cab and Cab Franc, Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot, historically Carmenere. The Rhone Valley has Syrah. Burgundy, of course, has Pinot Noir. That's kind of the big ones for reds. The Loire Valley has Cab Franc. Carignan was very much a filler grape for a lot of jug wines and boxed wines that came out of South France from the 1990s through the mid-2000s. Because if you plant a few hectares of it, you end up with lots and lots of liquid. And they were kind of counting on like Côte de Ventoux wines and, Côte de Languedoc that would be grocery store brands. You don't see a lot of it here, but in the UK, if you go to Sainsbury's or Marks and Spencer's or Tesco's, they will all have their own house brands of French wines, and they'll usually be the least expensive ones in the store, very close. That's kind of what they were counting on, why they planted so much Carignan. Carignan plantings in France at the time of the wine lake were about 146,000 hectares. It's now down to about 90,000 hectares, so it's fallen not quite by half, but certainly by a full third. And it's a neat grape. It doesn't give you... I don't know if I could ever really nail down what Carignan as a grape variety gives you. I mean, it's spicy, it's earthy, it's got some red fruit to it, but it's not quite the same thing where it's Syrah, it's got blue to black fruit, you get a strong note of black pepper. In good examples, you get like venison deer's blood. In really exceptional examples, you get like a real granite note. Cabernet Sauvignon, you'll get currants, of course, you'll get pepper, specifically white pepper, you'll get kind of a really neat leathery characteristic, you'll certainly get like tomato leaf and tobacco. With Carignan, it's like, yep, it generally tastes like wine. Which is neat because he's actually going for making wine with such an anonymous grape, and he's making it kind of his own here with the Love Red. Now in this example, very much cherry raspberry.
Thanks.
Me
too, please.
The raspberry note on this is actually so big and so juicy that it reminds me of when I was growing up, we drank a lot of the McCain's raspberry apple juice that came in the big frozen logs. This very much has that like almost tropical or over-the-top raspberry note on it. Also, if anyone wants to point out that we are at 6:26 and 3 wines in, this is what happens when no one asks any questions. Do they tear out the vines or graft onto the rootstock when they change grapes? Yeah, so what you're talking about is vine pull schemes, which you're right, are misnamed. Historically, they would actually rip the grapes out by the roots. That's really not done anymore. Everything now is planted, at least in Western Europe, on a North American rootstock that will be, it could even be Concord. And then they graft on Cabernet or Carignan or Sangiovese in Italy or Tempranillo in Spain. They graft on something else on top of it. So changing grapes, rather than being a process of 10, 15 years while you wait for like the rootstock to establish itself in the soil, can now be a process of like 2 years while you wait for like the graft to take. So excellent question there. In the mouth, I mean, how do you not like Love Red? This is one of our best-selling wines of the last few years for a reason. It's immediately likable, and it's immediately different from what you typically expect from Californian wines. It's not pitch black. It's not hyper extracted. It's lively. It's youthful. It has good acidity. It has appropriate alcohol. Because most red wines don't want to be 14.5% alcohol. How you get there is you leave them hanging on the vines, and this is going to turn into a condemnation of a lot of wineries, and I do mean it as such, but it's maybe a little mean for 6:26 in the evening. How you make a lot of these big over-extracted wines is you leave the fruit hanging on the vine so late that the berries are so overripe that they lose their endemic characteristics to it. So when we talked about this, we talked about that really cool blueberry into strawberry fruit. Well, if you leave this hanging on the vine to the point where the grapes are basically dessert wine, and the vine is pretty much shut down and is into like, let's just survive the winter mode, they're not going to taste like that anymore. They're just going to give you generic red fruit, which through skillful winemaking with a lot of oak aging, artificial acidification, vacuum distillation, and a lot of just futzing around in the winery, you can make this taste broadly like a big Californian cab. Not doing that and letting the grapes show themselves, I think, it's certainly been a fresh look at the wine industry the last few years. Ooh, what are we recommending for food pairings in the last two? This one's tricky because I'm going to go with the obvious one, which is like a brie wheel, because the higher acidity and that really pretty fruit on this is going to go really well with something like a relatively like flat background, like a brie or camembert, that really likes having like, would you ever serve warm brie and camembert and crackers without like some sort of red jelly? No, because you're not a crazy person. You'd want to have something like that, which is kind of where this steps in. Same is true of the box I Love Red, but because it's maybe a shade bigger, I think this can do more things. I actually like things like the Love Red with all that crackling acidity. I quite like it with things like blackened chicken. I like it with spicier foods where it kind of takes the place of a beer. Now, normally if you're saying, hey, I need a wine pairing for hot wings, I mean, you have like Vino Verde or New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc that are just light, crisp, designed to be served very, very cold, tons of acidity to just cleanse your palate. Now, if you ever go to dinner with my father, you will never, ever have white wine because he will insist on buying a bottle for the table and it will always be red. Now, something like this is one of those nice compromise wines. If you had to do a red wine and you were doing it with, say, cedar plank salmon, or you had to serve a red wine with sushi, which is a terrible idea, this would actually work with that. This wine, I think, is too light for something like a big steak dinner, certainly if you're going to put a really aggressive spice rub on it. This is not the right wine for a lot of your Szechuan dishes that have a lot of spice to them. This is a medium weight wine. I would ideally serve this something fairly simple, like a wheel of brie, like a roast chicken right out of the oven. It's subtle and it's delicate, and you don't want to overwhelm the food, but you also don't want to overwhelm the wine. If you pair this with something kind of medium to lighter in weight, the food is going to be able to express all of that herbalness, all the savoriness of the meat. The food can stand on its own, and the wine, while it will work with the food, the wine will also be able to show all of its characteristics. Really, the nuts and bolts of wine pairing is don't serve anything that's going to make, an actual copper compound form in your mouth, like tannin and shellfish, which is a real thing. It makes the wine actually taste like batteries to me. Tastes absolutely disgusting, and that's just tannin and the oil in a lot of shellfish and ocean fish just don't work together. They actually form a copper compound and it tastes disgusting. It's the same thing with a lot of other pairings where it's just, you're not trying to dominate the food with the wine. You're not trying to dominate the wine with the food. You're just trying to have them at the same level and working in harmony with each other. So I do a very aggressive tomato sauce when I'm just making pasta at home. I'll throw some ground beef in there, some Italian sausage. I like fennel seeds right in the hot oil at the start with the garlic. I like a little bit of cumin in there, mustard powder. Like, I make a big, powerful spaghetti sauce. And this wouldn't work. But if you're doing something very, very simple, if you're doing just like a very stripped down, right out of the garden, fresh basil, fresh tomatoes marinara, this would work beautifully. Because it doesn't have anything to match with Italian sausage, just everything that will go with fennel or a lot of garlic. It's a very delicate wine that doesn't need a lot of other things around it. Because of the fact that they're not doing the, vacuum distillation, we're just going to make the same wine every year, the vintage, like the climatic conditions be damned, they do have to vary the blend on this. Now, I like that. I like the fact that the wine is dictating what the blend is, because that's historically what wine was. Like, when we talk about Bordeaux, and we say, oh, well, Bordeaux's blend is... Sorry, that came up the wrong way. His, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Cabernet Franc and Malbec and Petit Verdot and Carmenere. It's not because they said, oh, well, all of those things go really well together. These are just 6 great tastes that taste great together. If they'd had their druthers, they'd have just planted Cabernet Sauvignon and been done with it. But in a very hot year, the Cabernet Sauvignon and the Petit Verdot would show very, very well. In a very, very cold year, the Cabernet Franc and the Merlot would show very, very well, while the Petit Verdot and the Cabernet Sauvignon wouldn't ripen. The Malbec would do moderately well in both years, and in a perfect year would be absolutely scrumptious, but it would add spice and body in the years where you had to make it with Merlot and Cabernet Franc. It would kind of stand in for Cabernet Sauvignon, and you'd use a bit of it there. And in very, very hot years, it would be there because the Merlot would not like that hot temperature. And in a typical Bordeaux blend, you want the Merlot to be there to give it lifeness and juiciness and youthfulness and freshness. But in a very, very hot year, the Merlot is basically going to get cooked out. You'd use Malbec to kind of step in and add freshness and youth, not quite in the same way, but in a similar way, to brighten up the Petit Verdot and the Cabernet Sauvignon. That's why we talk about, regions having blends. And of course, Burgundy now is pretty much 100% Pinot Noir, and the Northern Rhone now is 100% Syrah. But that's not historically how wine was made. You planted a lot of different things so that every single year, unless your whole crop got hailed out or something, you made wine every year. In a cold year, you made it with your cold weather grapes. In a hot year, you made it with your hot weather grapes. And in those perfect years, those 2 years in 10, your best wines of the decade, everything worked. But those weren't the typical year. You planted a wide spectrum so that you always had something, because wine is ultimately farming, and you need to feed your family off of what you made. So you went all in Cabernet. Sure, you'd eat like kings 3 years out of the decade, and 7 years out of the decade you'd be just barely scraping by, and maybe making like grappa or something out of it because it just wasn't drinkable as wine. So that about does it for the serious portion of the wine tasting. We're going to get to the chocolate sake in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about what we got coming up next week. Next week's a very special week. It is the first beer tasting not hosted by me. Craig, who you've seen in the comments section for most tastings the last couple of years, as well as Eric Dick. Craig and Eric will be taking over the beer tasting next week. I will not be in attendance at all. I'll actually be in Calgary. And they will be doing a malt-focused tasting with us. We'll be doing a couple from Hoyne. We'll be doing their Appleton... I keep wanting to call it an ESB, even though they don't, as well as their Dark Matter, a beer that they also don't name a style for. They'll dig more into that. As well as Driftwood, famous makers of Fat Tug. We have their Blackstone Porter, and we all know Blind Men. We all like Blind Men. We have their 24-2 Brown Ale. So, our two most prolific commenters over the last couple of years are getting together to take over my show. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I won't be in the building, but I will definitely be tuning in for the whole thing. So that is happening. Now, let's move on to our Valentine's chocolate. Before I put it in my glass, let's talk a little bit about what this is. So this is a sake. Sake is a really unique way of making a distilled product because just like with, say, making a beer or just like with making a barley, rice is not pure sugar. It's a complex starch in its natural form. Now, when we're talking about brewing or distilling, when we crush the barley and we mash it, what we're doing, the reason we're just, letting that barley sit with, warm water at about 70 degrees for an hour 15 minutes. It's not because, hey, that's a fun thing to do and it makes the whole brewery smell like oatmeal, which it does, but that's not why they do it. What they're doing is they're at that temperature, naturally occurring in the barley is a couple of enzymes, alpha and beta amylase, that convert those complex starches into simple sugars just by crushing the grain and adding warm water. That actually starts happening naturally on its own, which is crazy. Rice doesn't have that. Rice doesn't have alpha and beta amylase. So they have to add something to the rice to actually create that starch into sugar interaction, which is where koji comes in. Now, koji is a fungus. It's a black fungus. It looks really gross when it's growing on the rice, but it's also absolutely essential. It is the organism that actually converts all of those complex starches into sugars. Now, the koji is added to the rice, usually a portion of the rice, although in a very rare case it's 100% of the rice. It is all blended together. It is mashed together. The koji does the job of basically converting all those starches into simple sugars. The sake is brewed and fermented, and then it is clarified. It's literally pressed. Historically through cloth sacks. Now they have, sake pressing machines because 2022. But there are sakes that are not clear. Those are known as nigori sakis. They're often wrongly called unfiltered sakis. All sake by law has to be filtered. In this case, these rice solids and flour is added back, which is what gives us our lovely kind of thick chocolate malt sort of characteristic, which we're going to enjoy now. Now, this pours like a glass of chocolate milk with those lovely rice solids. And it drinks quite a bit like a chocolate milk. Now, I had held off. So Nikayuko Japanese Garden has sold this for like the last 3-4 years. They've been a big proponent to this product right from the start. I've been hesitant because I'd never tasted it. I was like, chocolate sake. It's just going to taste really artificial. The chocolate's going to clash with like the koji notes. It's not going to work. I wrecked my mic. It's not going to work. It's going to be silly. It's just a gimmick. Might be a gimmick. Probably is a gimmick. It's also absolutely delicious. This is a product that I really didn't want to like, but I really like. Those milk chocolate notes on the nose are right there. You get it in the mouth, and those rice solids, which are giving you this incredibly thick glass coating characteristic. That's just rice flour and little tiny bits of broken rice. It's giving you that dairy-like feel. And the chocolate is persistent right to the end. You get those little nips of koji just at the side to let you know you're drinking something that, started out as sake.
It's good.
Yeah, I think Craig sums it up well as this is completely bonkers. And he's quite correct. It is completely bonkers, but it's also very good. The moment that I actually got to taste this, which was only a few weeks ago, was actually the same day that I was kind of finalizing the list for the Valentine's wine tasting. I turned it down and I'm like, I'm going to do this. He's like, no, it's stupid. Yes, it is. It's absolutely stupid. You're completely correct. We're doing it anyway. Because I absolutely loved it and I wanted more people to try it. And the reason for that is, if I'd have come up to any of you in the store and started talking about chocolate sake, probably just turned around and walked out and be like, you know what, I'll just go to Costco and get some beer. That's fine. But if you taste it, if you try it, there's a lot to like here. And I've actually gone on to sell this to Bourbon and Butter and a couple of other bars for them to use actually in their chocolate martinis, because there is not a creme de cacao on earth that captures this much chocolate and this much of what I like about chocolate milk. Melted Frosty is a good call. Thank you, Raquel. Yeah, because it kind of has that, and again, we discussed this a little bit on Wednesday, because weird things come up in the beer tastings, that malted milk or chocolate malts also involved, like, malted barley at one point. Because old-timey drinks were weird. I mean, as I say, with a glass full of chocolate sake, old-timey drinks were weird. And I kind of wonder if maybe that malted barley was added because if you add kind of that starchy characteristic like the rice flour and rice solids are doing in this, it just amps up that perception of creaminess in body. I think maybe those old-timey chocolate malt folks were onto something. I'm curious if anyone loves this, hates this. This is what I thought was going to be the most controversial thing. Aaron, do you like it?
I love it.
You love it? Sky?
Oh, yeah.
Big fan?
Yeah.
All right, what about all of you? Lovers, haters? Do we have a consensus on this one? I'm curious how many people have this first and how many people have this last. And how many cowards are going to put it in the middle of the tasting?
Definitely chocolate milk for grown-ups.
Yeah, chocolate milk for grown-ups, except not one of those awful vodka milkshake beverage things. Don says this was made for her. Yeah, it's 10% alcohol. It's dangerous as anything because I could drink one of these like in the bath, just right out of the bottle, and just when I was done, be like, that was lovely. I want another one. Which, considering that if I told you this was like a 10% imperial stout, we'd all be like, oh man, that's nice, but the alcohol is so high. 10% of this just feels like nothing. Are either of you perceiving... So we've done Imperial Stout during the beer tastings many times. And at 10%, we're always talking about the booze. Even if it's a chocolate Imperial Stout, we pick up the alcohol. Do you really pick up alcohol in this?
Yes.
Do you do?
I do, yeah.
A little bit? Okay. I don't, but I have a really bad palate for alcohol, so... It'd be outstanding with dessert. I think it'd actually be really nice to mix into a dessert or to put on top of something. Like, really, even just this over, like, really good vanilla ice cream. Like, if you went to Milkman and got, like, one of their tubs of ice cream, it's like, we're having a dinner party. I don't really want to work for dessert. I'm just going to serve this and, like, some, like, caramelized fruit over really good vanilla ice cream. I'd be thrilled with this as dessert, because who wouldn't want that? Like, if you took, like, some brandy and some apples and some sugar and made, like, a caramel apple thing, put that over vanilla ice cream, topped it with this, you've got fancy adult dessert that just everybody's going to like.
You have YouTube comments.
Oh, read the YouTube comments.
You need to hear them.
I do.
Okay, so...
Sorry, this is a new thing. We have never had, like, live YouTube comments over 2 years.
Bought.
Okay.
I don't know, this is very B-A-R-R-Y.
But he's a bot.
We're getting lambic vibes, and I don't know if maybe referring to the
I'm
love,
guessing the Petsovits, if you're getting lambic vibes for me. We will get back to that, okay?
Back to that, but anyway.
Any other comments on the YouTube side?
How varied can it be before it comes to different wine?
Ooh. I assume that's talking about the difference between between red and rosé.
What's the question? Repeat the question.
Sorry, the question was how varied does it have to be before it becomes a different wine? Oh, it's talking about the blend. I'll loop back to my comment about Carignan and a little bit about just like the old way of making wine. This doesn't claim to be Love Carignan. It doesn't claim to be Love Zin. It doesn't claim to be Love Valdegay. It claims to be like the entry-level wine and again, entry-level wine at like $30 for a winery that makes wine up into the 60s, 70s. They're just saying this is our entry level. Welcome to Brock Cellars. Welcome to our world. If you've been drinking Californian wine, you haven't been drinking ours. Welcome to our universe, our way of doing things. And I think that they can get that message across, and certainly they believe they can get that message across without being consistent in terms of its grape varieties. Aaron, would you do me a real solid and get me a wine glass? Because I'd actually like to have some of the Brock Love Red. I don't think I'm going to appreciate all the subtleties out of this.
Okay. You just hang tight. They're all filthy, I guess.
Yeah, I think they're all filthy. Just grab me one of the little ones. It's not perfect, but it's better than standing here with nothing. Thank you, Aaron. But it's an interesting question, and I think that comes from how North Americans have been buying wine for a very long time. We started treating grape varieties as brand names, and let's go back to like an old school, you can take your pick here, Gallo, Wolf Blass, Heartland, J-Lore. Name a winery from Australia or North America. They treated their Cabernet Sauvignon as a brand name. They treated their Shiraz as a brand name. Wolf Blass was the one that actually came into mind first because, while now everything is yellow label, you know, the yellow label was the Cabernet, the green label was the Shiraz, the red label was the Shiraz Cab, the blue label was the Merlot. Grape varieties quite literally as brand names, as branding. That wasn't historically how wine was made, but it's very much a, like, I was born in 1982, I started in the wine industry in 2000, and when I started, very, very much like the very first wine that I got excited about was Luigi Bosca Merlot, which now seems kind of embarrassing. But Luigi Bosca Merlot was Luigi Bosca Blue label, and the Luigi Bosca Malbec was the Burgundy to Red label. You want the love of red, don't you, Mark? But it's a fascinating question, and it's very much a perception of how we look at grape varieties as brand names. And that's very much a creation of the Gallo brothers, the Wolf Blass folks, everybody kind of post 1990, 2-ish, I want to say, where brand names were very closely tied to grape varieties. I would say that, and again, I really hate to give props to it, Apothic Red kind of started changing the idea of that, where Apothic Red is Apothic Red. It still tastes like shit, but if you have, the blend varies year to year to year. Now, part of the reason the blend varies year to year is everything I said about how you shouldn't make wine with vacuum distillation and leaving the grapes on the vine until they don't taste anything. That's part of it. But the idea of having a wine as a brand on its own, you almost have to go back to things like Le Pied d'Or, to like Domaine d'Or Red. The idea, or even back to these grocery brands of the early 2000s in the UK, where the wine is the brand. What's in the bottle, well, that's up to the winemaker. I think we kind of got a little too attached to individual grape varieties and single variety wines, of which we actually have none of on the table. Everything in front of us is a blend. I think that grape varieties as brands, it certainly hasn't had its day. Josh Cellars Cab, I think, is the number 2 selling red wine in Alberta, behind only Apothic Red. So certainly people do like their grape varieties as brand names, but it's not unique. Oh, and now I've actually got live YouTube comments in front of me. Barry Bot claims he's not a bot. It's just what a bot would say. More about the difference in years, and you like this year versus last year. I don't have the 2019 Love Red in front of me, so I can't really comment. But I think the idea of making the best wine that you can in a single vineyard from the things that you have access to is a better way of making wine versus this is Josh Cellars Cab and come hell or high water, we are going to make Cab. Now, there are parts of the world like Argentina and Chile, which are kind of like a winemaker's paradise, where almost no matter what you do, the grapes ripen and the wine turns out, where you can just say, yes, we're a Cab winery. We're going to plant nothing but Cab, and we're going to make nothing but that. And it's going to be fine 9 years out of 10 or 19 years out of 20, it's going to be fine because the climate's so perfect for making wine there. But that's not reality for most winemaking regions, at least not the good ones. And this is something we didn't touch on tonight, and I'm actually kind of glad we get to. Wine, to a certain point, great wine. Why don't I have any $100 Chilean or Argentine wines in this room? I have some $50 stuff. Yes, I do. Because wine grapes don't want to be coddled. They want to be grown on the bleeding edge. And that's because how the vine, again, I'm going to kind of anthropomorphize a grapevine here a little bit, but they want to be, well, they don't want to be. They make better wine when they think they're going to die. When you basically plant a grapevine and, you go out and you play it very soft music every day and you give it all the fertilizer it wants and all the water it wants and you pet it gently and, you cover it when it's sunny, it's going to give you grapes. Yes, it is. It's going to give you a very large number of grapes that are not going to taste like a goddamn thing. They're going to be super sugar rich. They're going to be super water heavy. They are going to be very poor quality because the grapevine's saying, oh, wow, things are great for me. I should just put all my effort into becoming a bigger grapevine. I'm going to become what's called very vigorous. I'm going to put out tons of shoots and leaves and stems and sticks, and it's just going to be this big bush. But if things are really, really bad for the vine, if it's right on that bleeding edge of life and death, it's thinking in this case, I'm going to die. This is my last year. This is it for me. I'd better put everything I can into the next generation. I'd better put everything into my children, my grapes. It doesn't know that we're going to harvest the grapes and make wine out of them. But it's putting everything into the next generation only when it thinks it's going to die. That's why we plant grapes on, 45-degree slopes straight into granite. It's why we plant Cabernet Sauvignon right on the bleeding edge of where it can actually ripen. Well, pre-climate change, right where it could actually ripen. This is why great winemakers plant grapes in regions where they know they're going to fail 4 years out of 10, because 6 years out of 10, they're going to be right on that cusp of failing, and they're going to give you genius quality wines because the grapevine thinks it's going to die. It's going to put all its effort into its grapes. That's part of why blending works, and part of why, a single vineyard isn't just Cabernet unless you're in California or Chile. It's why you plant different things is, in a hot year for the Merlot, yeah, a lot of years the Merlot is going to be cooked. But sometimes, if it's hot enough, converse to what you might think, in really screamingly hot years, once in 40 years hot years in Bordeaux, the Merlot will actually think it's actually going to die from like heat stroke, basically. And it's going to just say, you know what, I'm going to put everything in the grapes. And the Merlot will turn out in a very hot year. You have to harvest it really early. You're probably harvesting it the second week of August, but it's actually going to turn out. The alcohol is just apparent up front. They make the best wine when they think they're going to die. That's actually kind of the tagline of making great wine. Like, why in the Rheingau they planted on these, you know, steep slopes that to this day, some wineries don't harvest some of their vineyards because what they have to pay in danger pay for people to go up into those vineyards to harvest the grapes, they can't make back because they can't charge enough for the wine, because these people are hanging basically in a harness off a cliff picking grapes, and you know, you can't pay minimum wage for that. At least you bloody well shouldn't. It's one of those things where grapes like to grow. Well, they don't like to grow. They make great wine when they're asked to grow not quite where they shouldn't, but just on the line of, you're going to make lots of wine. You're not going to make wine. But right on that nebulous border, right on that gray area, that's kind of the genius zone. So the stuff down here, and this is part of the problem with Carignan in the south of France, is Carignan was almost too successful. It was happy to give you lots and lots of wine. It just wasn't very good. But if you'd maybe planted Carignan closer, planted somewhere where it really doesn't belong, like California, it can give you some really interesting results. Now, I'm not going to say that the Carignan from California is necessarily better than the Carignan from France. It's not really taken seriously either place. But if you really asked that Carignan to push itself, if you planted it somewhere like northern Germany where it really wasn't happy, it might produce something truly exceptional. But as long as you keep planting it in the south of France where it's happy and it grows like a bad weed, it's never going to give you genius results. So that's kind of my big, long philosophical rant about making wine in general. And just like that, as it seems it always happens, we were at 3 wines at 36 minutes past, and apparently I've been talking for 54 minutes. So I'll let time pass a little tiny bit, see if we have any more... Yeah, very exactly. Increased environmental pressure, better tasting grapes. And it's purely because the vine is incentivized to put its effort into the next generation rather than the current year. I'll let a couple more comments come in, and then I think we will start wrapping things up. You'll notice I do not have a promo for next Friday or the Friday after. Part of the reason for that is I've had 4 tastings in 4 nights. I had a tasting in Pitcher Creek on Tuesday with a beer tasting Wednesday. I was at Nikiyuka last night, and now we're doing a wine tasting. And to be honest, I just want to go home and go to bed. So we will have something on a Friday night, sometime around St. Patrick's Day. It will, appropriately enough, be a whiskey tasting.
Hey.
I'd like to do something Irish, but I can only get a couple of Waterfords, and we've done a lot of work with Waterford anyway. If anyone has any really genius ideas, please leave them in the comments, because I'm kind of struggling with what I want to do for a tasting. I mean, the complete shill in me wants to do like an Irish whiskey tasting for St. Patrick's Day, but I also don't want to do that. I'd rather do something more interesting. But I'm kind of struggling for a topic on that. But we will have something coming up in definitely 3 Fridays from tonight, because we're skipping the next 2. For tonight, though, I think we'll call it right there. Sky, hell of a job. First time flying solo.
Thank you.
We'll get you drunked up real good in a minute. Aaron, thank you as always. And to all of you watching at home, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Kyle with Andrew Hilton. Thank you all for continuing to tune in and continue to buying the wine kits, because as much as I whine about doing 4 tastings in a week, this is really what I want to do more than anything else in the world, and you folks make it happen. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend. Good night.